The coffee is still too hot to drink. He wraps both hands around the mug anyway. Outside, a neighbor is dragging a cooler across the driveway. Red cups on a folding table. The 4th of July doing what it always does, starting slow, then arriving all at once. This week, America turns 250 years old. 250 years. Think about what that number actually means. The longest-running constitutional democracy on Earth, still here, still holding its shape. There will be ceremonies in Philadelphia, a naval fleet review in New York Harbor, the largest coordinated fireworks display in the country's history, flags on every post office from Bangor to San Diego, and underneath the spectacle, if you let yourself feel it straight, without the reflex of irony, something genuinely earned. A country that has fractured and reformed, that has failed its own stated ideals and then bent, slowly, back toward them. 250 years is not nothing. It is, in fact, extraordinary. But here's what's also true. If you're somewhere around 50, you're not just watching this milestone from the outside. You're running a parallel number in your head, not out of fear exactly, not out of grief. Just the mind does what it does. You look at the celebration, and then you look at the photograph on the kitchen table. Your parents, younger than you are now. Your kids, back when they still needed to be carried. You squinting into summer light, somewhere in the middle. And the math assembles itself quietly, without your permission. That involuntary arithmetic. If you're in this season of life, you know exactly what I mean. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with alarm bells. It just shows up one morning between the coffee being too hot and the coffee being right. And it asks a question you haven't figured out how to answer yet. If the country is marking what it's built across 250 years, what are you marking? Not in a dark way. That's important to say plainly. This is not about crisis. This is about something more specific than crisis. The recognition that the first half of a life generates momentum, and the second half asks you what that momentum was actually for. Most men at this age have done the work, raised the kids, built something at a job or tried to, kept their word more often than not. And still, on a morning like this one, the question finds a gap in the noise and steps through. The noise is real. The obligations, the calendar, the next thing and the thing after that. They fill the days, but they don't answer the question. They defer it. He picks up the coffee. It's the right temperature now. Outside, a child runs across the lawn. Someone laughs. The day is starting. Indifferent, generous, already in motion. That's where we begin today. Not with a warning, not with a self-help framework. With one man, one photograph, and a national birthday that lands differently when you're old enough to count alongside it. Because there's something America's 250th anniversary makes visible, if you're willing to look at it directly. A country can mark its years and still ask what it's becoming. So can a man. That's not a small question. It's the only one worth staying with this morning. You can feel it before you can name it. Something in the waiting room you sat in with a parent, or a grandparent, or someone you loved. The fluorescent light, the low-grade antiseptic smell that never fully resolves into clean. The quiet that isn't peaceful, It's the quiet of people who have learned to wait without expecting much. These are not forgotten people. They are the proof of the headline. They are the years that got added. They are what the progress looks like up close, without the press conference lighting. That feeling, the one that sat in your chest when you walked out of that room, is worth taking seriously, because it's not dread and it's not irrational. It's recognition. Some part of you already understood that what you were looking at was not what the promise described. The man counting years is not alone in making this calculation. America made the same one, ran it forward and called it progress. And for a long time, the numbers agreed. Life expectancy climbed. Decade by decade, the line on the graph moved upward. And the institutions that track such things, the health departments, the policy centers, the magazine editors, pointed to that line the way you point to a trophy. Asterisk, look what we built. Look how long we last now. Asterisk, Forbes said it plainly not long ago. America has added years to the average life. The math was real. 30 years ago, the average American didn't expect to reach their late 70s. Now they do. That is not nothing. That is hospitals and medications and sanitation and surgical precision and 100 other things that deserve credit. But here is what the headline doesn't say, and what the graph doesn't show, and what nobody at the press conference mentioned on the way out. Adding years to a life is not the same as adding life to the years. That is a clinical distinction. And the data behind it is the part of the story that doesn't get covered. The United States has one of the highest rates of chronic disease burden in the developed world. Not chronic disease asterisk death asterisk. Chronic disease asterisk living asterisk. Americans are surviving conditions that used to kill quickly, and surviving them for decades. Type 2 diabetes, hypertension, osteoarthritis, chronic lower back pain, the category that researchers call multimorbidity, the compounding of two or more serious chronic conditions in a single body. That category has become, in the language of public health, an epidemic inside the epidemic. According to the National Academy of Medicine, more than 60% of American adults over 65 now live with at least two chronic conditions simultaneously. Not occasionally, not seasonally, asterisk continuously asterisk, as a permanent background weather system in their bodies. And then there's the other number, the one that almost never leads a segment. The United States has one of the widest gaps in the developed world between asterisk lifespan asterisk, how long you live, and asterisk healthspan asterisk, how long you live well. The gap in recent estimates is close to 12 years. 12 years. That is the average American's window of managed decline before the end. Pain that doesn't fully respond to treatment. Fatigue that sleep no longer fixes. Dependence on medications, on assistance, on someone else's schedule and patience and availability. 12 years is not a footnote. 12 years is enough time to raise a child from kindergarten to high school graduation, and for a significant portion of aging Americans, those years are spent navigating a healthcare system that is extraordinarily good at extending biological function and genuinely unprepared to address the quality of the life being extended. There is a particular texture to this kind of suffering, and it is worth describing honestly. It is not the suffering of a dramatic diagnosis. It is quieter than that. It arrives gradually, the way a house settles, small sounds, small shifts, things you adapt to so continuously that you stop noticing the adaptation. The walk that used to take 20 minutes now takes 30, and you've stopped timing it. The social event that used to feel easy now requires 2 days of recovery, and you've adjusted your calendar without naming why. The pain that used to appear occasionally now has no clear absence. It's just there with varying intensity, a permanent companion that hasn't introduced itself, but has clearly decided to stay. And underneath all of it, something harder to measure: the loss of autonomy, the gradual, undignified erosion of the sense that your life is yours to navigate, that you are the one deciding the pace, the direction, the terms. That erosion is its own kind of injury, and it doesn't appear on the life expectancy graph. The promise embedded in every health initiative and pharmaceutical advertisement and wellness industry product launch is that more time equals more living. It is a beautiful promise. It is also, for a substantial number of people, a broken one, not because the years weren't added, but because what arrived with them was not what the promise described. If you're watching this at 45 or 52 or 60, and something tightened in your chest when you pictured that waiting room, don't push it away. That tightening has information in it. Some part of you already suspects that the trajectory described in the Forbes article has your name on it somewhere. Unless something changes, that suspicion is worth following. It is the beginning of asking a different question. Not whether the numbers are real. They are. The question is what's hiding underneath them. The longevity data is telling two stories at once. The first one has been reported extensively. The second one, the one that reframes how you read the first, is the story this series is built around. It exists in the research. It exists in the clinical literature, and it has not yet made its way into the conversation most people are having about their own futures. That's what the rest of this is for. There's a number that comes out of the CDC every few years, and most people glance at it and feel a small, quiet satisfaction. Life expectancy in the United States is up. Not dramatically, not without interruption, but the trend line over the last century moves in one direction. We live longer than our grandparents did, longer than our parents probably expected we would. That's the headline, and the headline is true. But the Forbes piece that circulated a few months back, the one about America's longevity revolution, the one that got shared around with a kind of cautious optimism, left something out. It left out the part where the extra years arrive broken. That's not a metaphor. That's the finding. Here is what the data actually shows when you pull it apart. The average American will spend roughly the last 12 to 17 years of their life in a state of meaningful functional limitation. Not terminal illness necessarily, not hospitalization, something quieter and harder to name: chronic pain, cognitive fog, mobility that narrows the radius of a life. fatigue that makes the afternoon feel like a wall. The CDC tracks this. Researchers at the University of Minnesota and the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation have spent years trying to quantify what they call the Healthspan gap, the distance between how long we live and how long we live with full functional capacity. And that gap in the United States is widening. Lifespan has been climbing. Healthspan has not kept pace. We are, as a population, getting better at extending the years while quietly failing to fill them. Think about what that actually means in a body. Not in a chart, in a body. The alarm sounds at 6:30, and before you are fully awake, you are already running an inventory. Left hip, lower back, which has been reporting in every morning for the last 3 years, like an unreliable colleague. The right shoulder that requires a specific negotiation before you can reach overhead. You know this inventory. Most people in their mid-40s and 50s have one, and most of them have filed it under getting older and moved on because what else would you call it? And because the doctor said nothing was wrong. Not really. Not yet. That morning assessment, the cataloging before the day begins, is itself a data point. It is the Healthspan gap made personal, made small enough to ignore. There's a term, compression of morbidity, first proposed by Stanford physician James Fries back in 1980. The idea was elegantly hopeful. If we could delay the onset of chronic disease and disability, we might compress all the hard years into a much shorter window near the end of life. Live well for a long time, decline quickly and exit. Fries believed this was biologically possible. What the data from the last 4 decades shows is that we have done the opposite. We have expanded morbidity. We have stretched the difficult years, added duration to the period of limitation, and called it progress because the total number on the life expectancy counter went up. What happened instead of compression is something more like smearing. The difficulty didn't concentrate at the end. It distributed itself across the final third and started arriving earlier than anyone expected, not as crisis, but as accumulation. The knee that changes how you move, the sleep that stops being restorative and starts being something you merely do, the cognitive sharpness that was always there, and then one afternoon you notice it taking longer to retrieve the word, the name, the thread of the argument. Is small, easy to rationalize, happening earlier than it should. The researchers who work in preventive and functional medicine have been saying, carefully, with data, that this early contraction is not an inevitable feature of biological aging. It is an outcome, a result of specific, measurable processes that were not managed in time, inflammatory load that accumulated without intervention, metabolic drift that went unaddressed, sleep architecture that degraded over years, without anyone treating it as a medical priority. The body was sending signals. The healthcare system was not listening for them, because it is not built to listen for them. It is built to intervene in crisis, not to track the slow erosion of function over decades. Peter Attia, a physician who writes and practices at the intersection of preventive medicine and performance biology, makes a distinction that cuts through the usual framing. He separates the abrupt end, the cardiac event, the accident, the acute diagnosis, from what he calls the marginal decade. The last 10 years, where quality of life either holds or it doesn't. His observation is that almost the entire architecture of conventional medicine is organized around preventing the abrupt end, while almost nothing is organized around protecting the quality of the slow years. We have a system built to keep you from dying suddenly, and a near total absence of system built to help you remain capable. The result is that people survive into the years they were promised and find them narrower than they imagined. Mark Hyman, founding director of the Cleveland Clinic Center for Functional Medicine, draws on longitudinal population data to make a related point. The systems we rely on to keep us healthy are primarily designed to keep us alive. These are not the same thing. This is not a fringe position. It is a structural description of what the data shows when you look at outcomes rather than survival rates. And here is where the question becomes personal, not political, because you can look at all of this from a distance, as a healthcare policy problem, as a public health failure, as something that happens to populations, and that distance is comfortable. It is also a form of removal from the actual terrain of your own body, which is not a population. It is one specific set of systems that have been accumulating inputs for 40 or 50 years, and which are, right now, trending somewhere. There is something almost strange about realizing that the extra years we were promised may not arrive the way we imagined them. Most of us, somewhere in the background of our planning, not consciously, not as a formal belief, but as a kind of ambient assumption, have pictured a future self who is essentially still us, is still sharp, is still capable, is still engaged. The research suggests this future self requires more deliberate construction than we assumed, that the years between now and then are not a waiting room. They are the intervention. The Healthspan gap is real. It is documented. It is widening in the United States in ways that correlate with specific lifestyle and systemic factors. But it is not uniform. The same researchers who mapped the gap are also pointing to significant variance in the data, meaning that the deteriorating end of that distribution and the thriving end are not randomly assigned. The factors that predict which end someone occupies are, to a meaningful degree, modifiable, not fixed by genetics, not sealed by the past. What those factors are specifically, and why the gap is being driven wider by something that most health coverage never names clearly. That is where this goes next. The epidemiologists who have looked most carefully at the divergence between lifespan and healthspan have noted a variable that keeps surfacing across studies, across populations, across age cohorts. They tend to describe it in hedged language, not because the signal is weak, but because it reaches into territory their instruments weren't originally designed to map. The signal is consistent. The hesitation around it is professional, not scientific. Something is driving the split, and the evidence increasingly suggests it is upstream of the physical arriving in the body. Yes, and measurable there, but originating somewhere the standard intake form never asks about. There is a moment, and maybe you've had it recently, When you look at a Tuesday afternoon and cannot account for it, not because something went wrong. Nothing went wrong. The day moved. Emails answered. Lunch eaten. The dog walked. Maybe a phone call with someone you've known for years. And then the light shifts the way it does around 4 o'clock in October. That particular amber that falls sideways through the window and lands on the floor in a long rectangle that wasn't there an hour ago. And something in you goes quiet in a way that has nothing to do with tiredness. The house holds a specific kind of stillness. The refrigerator hums. Outside, a car passes, and then there's nothing. It's not sadness. It's something more spacious than sadness, and somehow harder to name. There is a word for the gap between time moving and meaning keeping pace, between the distance you've covered and the sense that you chose the direction. Not a clinical term, not something from a paper, just the most honest description of what it actually feels like. Drift. The sensation that days are absolutely moving. The calendar confirms it. The gray at your temples confirms it. But that something underneath isn't advancing at the same rate. Like a boat that's covered a lot of water, but can't quite locate the port it was heading toward. The engine running fine. The hull sound. Just the coordinates uncertain. This is not depression. I want to be clear about that. Because depression is a specific thing with specific weight, and what I'm describing is quieter and far more common. The people who feel this are, by most measures, functioning. They show up. They are competent. They sometimes laugh. But underneath the functioning, there's a low, persistent question that doesn't ask itself out loud. It just sits. It sits in the silence after the day ends and the noise stops. And it has a texture. If you felt it, you know it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a crisis or a confrontation. It seeps in. It shows up when a song you loved at 35 comes on, and instead of pleasure, you feel something closer to distance. It shows up when you're introduced to someone new and find you have no instinct about what to say you're building toward. It shows up in the difference between being busy and being engaged. Two things that look identical from the outside and feel nothing alike from the inside. The structural loneliness piece is part of this, and it's real, and it deserves to be said plainly. After 45, the social architecture that was holding things together, the workplace rhythms, the children's schedules, the shared project of building something often begins to thin, not collapse. Thin. Friends drift into their own interiors. Marriages settle into logistics. The spontaneous, slightly chaotic togetherness of younger decades gives way to something more organized and frequently more solitary. You can be in a full house and feel the specific quiet of being the only one in your own experience. This is not a failure. It's a structural reality, and the research bears it out. A 2020 study out of the University of California, San Diego tracked adults between 45 and 75 and found that what they called meaningful engagement, not just activity, not just social contact, but interaction felt as genuinely purposeful, dropped by roughly 40% across that age range. 40%. Not because those adults had failed to build good lives, but because the architecture of purpose in midlife often goes unrebuilt after the original scaffolding comes down. What's harder to say, and what this needs to say, is that the emptiness isn't usually recognized as a crisis until it's been running for years. Because it's quiet, because the days still move, because by most measures, everything is fine. And fine is one of the most effective silencers in the language. You cannot bring yourself to say something is wrong when you can't point to the wound. So you don't say it. You file it somewhere. You keep moving. And the filing doesn't make it inert. The unspoken question doesn't dissolve just because it goes unspoken. It stays. It accumulates. It reshapes, slowly and without announcement, the quality of your days. This is the finding that doesn't make it into the wellness headlines, because it's too uncomfortable to be packaged. The researchers at Stanford who have been measuring the gap between years accumulated and meaning advancing keep arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion. Duration without direction doesn't stay neutral. It compounds. Philip Roth described midlife as the moment when the mortgages of borrowed momentum come due. The momentum of institutions, of family roles, of careers that told you what mattered next. When those institutions pull back and the roles shift, the bill arrives, not dramatically, in the way that October light comes through the window sideways and lands on the floor in that long rectangle. And you look at a Tuesday afternoon and cannot account for where the last several years went, or what they were for. This is happening quietly, in millions of households where nothing is technically wrong. It is not a story of catastrophe. It is a story of drift. And drift is the hardest thing to address because it doesn't feel urgent. It doesn't bleed. It just floats, and the days keep moving around it. And the years accumulate in a way that feels, from the inside, more like weather than like living. The question that has been sitting underneath all of this is whether what we've been describing is only emotional, because the researchers aren't measuring mood alone. They are measuring cortisol patterns across years, inflammatory markers in people who report high purposelessness versus low, neural activity in the prefrontal cortex during tasks that used to feel meaningful and now feel rote. The drift has a biological address. It is leaving a specific, measurable signature in the body, one that connects, more directly than most people have been told, to how the next decades actually go. That's where we go next. You already know the feeling, not the name for it, the feeling itself. The way you wake up, and the first thing that arrives isn't energy or dread. It's just weight, a flatness. Like the day has already decided what it's going to be before you've stood up. And what it's decided is more of the same. You lie there for a moment longer than you need to, not because you're tired, but because nothing is pulling you forward. And you've been telling yourself that's the news, the years, the age, the season. And maybe it is. But your body has been keeping a different record. And that record has been showing up in places you never thought to look. There's a study worth knowing about. Not a wellness blog. Not a podcast recommendation. A longitudinal study published in JAMA Internal Medicine, tracking thousands of adults over 45 across several years, looking at something specific. What happens inside the body, biologically, measurably? When a person loses the felt sense that today is different from yesterday, that tomorrow is worth preparing for. Not depression, something more diffuse and far more common. The researchers called it carefully and precisely what it was: a drift, an absence of organizing pull. The kind of thing you might not describe to your doctor, because it doesn't feel like a symptom. It feels like Tuesday. The findings were not subtle. Imagine waking at 4 in the morning. The room is cold in the particular way rooms get in the early hours. The heat off, the silence pressing against the windows, the darkness heavier than darkness at midnight ever feels. You're not anxious exactly. You just can't get back under. The mind is doing something low and circular, not catastrophizing, just running. And you think, I've slept 8 hours maybe. So why does this feel like I haven't slept at all? That's not incidental. That's the body answering a question you haven't consciously asked yet. What the JAMA research documented is that adults living in that state of purposive drift, people who would describe their days as mechanical, as going through the motions, as fine, were showing disrupted sleep architecture. Not fewer hours necessarily, different hours. The deep stages, the ones where the brain does its repair work, where the immune system resets and the cellular waste gets cleared. Those stages were being cut short, compressed. The body was in bed, but not completing the work that sleep is supposed to do, because something in the system never fully disengaged, never got the all clear. You can feel this in your body right now if you think about it honestly. That particular exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix. The same study, cross-referenced with data from the National Institute on Aging, found something else in these adults: elevated markers of low-grade systemic inflammation. Not the acute kind, not the kind that responds to a cut or an infection, that flares and subsides. The chronic kind, the kind that runs quietly in the background, so quiet you don't feel it as pain. You feel it as effort, as the way ordinary things feel heavier than they used to, as the way recovery takes longer than it should, as the way you can spend a weekend doing nothing and still feel like you haven't rested. The body, the researchers concluded, reads purposive drift as a threat signal, not metaphorically, chemically. The absence of direction, the absence of forward pull, registers in the same biological language as low-level danger. The immune system responds to it. The inflammatory cascade responds to it. The nervous system, trying to stay ready for something that never arrives and never resolves, stays stuck in a posture of mild alarm. Not panic, just never fully at rest. Here is what that sounds like from the inside. The lowest, almost inaudible hum. Constant, so constant that you stopped noticing it years ago. That hum is your body working against itself, quietly, expensively, day after day. The researchers also looked at heart rate variability, the variation between individual heartbeats, which is controlled by the part of the nervous system operating below conscious thought. High variability means the system is flexible, capable of moving between states, capable of surging and recovering. Low variability means it's contracted, it's stuck, operating with less range than it should. Adults in the drift cohort showed measurably quieter rhythms. Beat by beat, the heart was running with less dynamic capacity than their counterparts of the same age and health profile. Less capacity to recover, less capacity to adapt. The body calibrating down, beat by beat, to match the life it had been given to carry. This is not a mood problem. That's the thing the data keeps insisting on. And it matters because mood problems feel personal, feel like weakness, feel like something you should be able to talk yourself out of. This is a physiological state, measurable, documented, in the blood, in the sleep cycles, in the beat of the heart. And here is the part of this that actually matters. It's modifiable, not with a supplement, not with a checklist you fill out for 11 days and then lose on your phone. The research points towards something more specific, something that operates at the level where the signal originates, not at the level where you're trying to manage the symptoms after they've already arrived. The body has been keeping score honestly. The score can change, and you're already closer to understanding how than you were when you woke up this morning with that weight on your chest and nothing pulling you forward. That's not nothing. That's actually the beginning of something. There is a specific feeling that has become so familiar most men stop noticing it. Not panic, not depression, something quieter than that. A tightness behind the sternum that was there when you woke up this morning. That was there yesterday. That has been there long enough you've stopped calling it tension and started calling it normal. The low hum of readiness for bad news. The breath that never quite reaches the bottom of the lungs. You open the phone, something contracts. You close the phone, it doesn't fully let go. That feeling has a biological address. That's what nobody told you clearly, and that's what this chapter is about. The researchers at the University of Pittsburgh were not studying feelings. They were studying tissue. Specifically, they were tracking the molecules your immune system produces when it believes, rightly or wrongly, consciously or not, that the body is running a low, constant emergency. C-reactive protein, interleukin-6, fibrinogen, the quiet chemical vocabulary of a system that has decided to stay braced. And what they found, tracking people across time, measuring their internal state and then looking at the blood, was not subtle. The people who lived in chronic internal contraction showed significantly elevated inflammatory markers compared to those who didn't. Not slightly elevated, significantly. And that inflammatory load, sustained over months and years, is the molecular environment in which cellular aging accelerates. It is the medium in which your body quietly decides, every night, how much repair is worth doing. Same age, same country, different internal state, different biology, not as metaphor, as measurement. Take two men, 62, sit them in the same kitchen on the same Tuesday morning, coffee going, the same news on the same phone. Both of them know about Medicare solvency. Both of them have watched the political temperature of this country do what it's done for the last decade. Both have the same, roughly clean blood work on paper. But one of them sits in that kitchen, and something in his chest stays slightly closed. Not because he's weak, not because he's failing, but because he has adapted to a low-grade frequency of threat that arrived so gradually, he never got the chance to refuse it. His breath is a little shallow. The muscles across his shoulders haven't released since he can't remember when. He doesn't feel anxious. He feels like himself. But the markers are in the blood, recording everything. The other man reads the same headlines. He is not cheerful about them. He is not performing optimism. But something in how his nervous system processes the information is different. Not philosophical, not spiritual, biological. It returns to baseline faster. His breath, without any conscious protocol, sits a little deeper in the body. His chest, without him noticing, is open rather than braced. His body spends more of its time in repair than in readiness for threat. A same age, same morning, same kitchen light. Radically different internal frequency. Radically different inflammatory load. Radically different rate of cellular aging. That is what the Pittsburgh study documented. And what it added, what made it more than a correlation, was mechanism. Previous research had shown that people who feel better tend to live longer. Interesting but soft. What Pittsburgh started to map was the actual pathway. How the chronic background state of the nervous system translates into specific inflammatory signals, and how those signals govern the pace at which the body ages at the cellular level. Correlation says there's a relationship. Mechanism says here is the road. Here is how the traffic moves. Here is why the direction matters. Mechanism is what makes something real. Mechanism is what makes something you can actually do something with. Let me be precise about what this is not. This is not a claim that positive thinking dissolves disease. It is not a claim that you can gratitude your way past a serious diagnosis. Those conversations belong in different rooms with different evidence, and collapsing them together is how people get hurt. What the Pittsburgh data supports is narrower, more durable, and more honest. The chronic background frequency of your internal state is a measurable biological variable. It influences your inflammatory load over time, and your inflammatory load over time is one of the primary levers determining how quickly the body ages. That is immunology. That is effective science. That is longitudinal data with specific molecular markers. It is not warm. It is not soft. It is a hard biological fact sitting inside a space most people have been trained to treat as purely psychological, and it reframes the entire question this video has been building toward. Because the conversation about American longevity, the public health reports, the think pieces, the Senate hearings about life expectancy rankings, almost all of it frames the problem as a question of duration. How many years? How many Americans make it to 80, 85, 90? That is a real question, but it is not the most important question. The more important question is what is actually happening inside those years. Not how long, just how inhabited. Whether the man spending those years is living in a body that is oriented toward the world, or a body that is bracing against it. Whether the frequency inside the years has the quality of a system that is alive and engaged, or a system running an emergency no one officially declared. The Pittsburgh study gives that difference a number. It shows up in a blood draw, which means the national longevity crisis, the one measured in hospital costs and life expectancy charts, and ranking below 30 other countries, is downstream of something that lives closer to home than any policy can reach. It is downstream of millions of people sitting in the same kind of Tuesday morning kitchen, chest tight, breath shallow, carrying an internal whether they did not choose and were never told was optional. The crisis is not primarily in the legislation. It is in the accumulated chronic state of people who adapted to low-grade threat so slowly they forgot they were carrying it. You are not obligated to carry it just because it has been there a long time. Here is what this actually means for you in the body on a Wednesday, in a specific room with specific light coming through a specific window. The years ahead are not just slots to fill. They are not boxes to check, while the body runs its quiet emergency toward an inevitable stop. The question, the one the Pittsburgh data forces into the open, is whether the frequency inside those years is the frequency of a system that is actually inhabiting its own life, or the frequency of a system that has been managing an unnamed emergency for so long it forgot what the alternative felt like. You already know which one you've been living closer to. The next question, the harder one, is what it actually looks like in biological terms to shift it. Not in theory, in the body, in the blood. That question has a real answer, and it begins closer to the ground than most men expect. You are watching this right now because something in you already knows, not in a vague way, in the way where your shoulders have been slightly raised for longer than you can remember, and sleep doesn't fully reset you the way it used to, and you keep reading about longevity and inflammation and cellular aging, not out of casual curiosity, but out of something that feels closer to urgency. That feeling is real. It is also data. And what the data is telling you is not that something is wrong with you. It is that you have been absorbing something enormous, something that has weight and texture and a direct biological address inside your body. And no one has quite named what that costs or what you can actually do about it. That is what the next several minutes are for. Here is what happened recently that you need to know about fully, not as backdrop. On June 14th, 2025, the United States marked 249 years since its founding, 1 year out from the 250th anniversary that every institution in this country is already treating as a referendum on itself. The coverage was not celebratory. It was fractured, loud, and suffused with a particular kind of collective exhaustion that news anchors perform as gravitas, but that you probably feel in your actual body as something more like dread. Debates about what the country is, what it was, whether it is still becoming something, broadcast across every platform, every hour, landing inside the nervous systems of everyone watching, including yours. That is not a metaphor. That is a physiological event. And here is the piece that almost no one in that coverage mentioned, because it doesn't fit the format of breaking news, but is, in terms of your life, more consequential than most of what does. Your biology is responding to your attentional state in real time. The chronic low-frequency stress of absorbing a civilization arguing with itself, and bracing, and recovering, and bracing again, shows up in inflammatory markers, in cardiovascular load, in immune suppression, in what researchers at the University of Pittsburgh, tracking 900 adults across 16 years, measured as accelerated biological aging. The people in that study who showed up a decade younger in their biological markers were not people who had been shielded from difficulty. Many of them had experienced significant loss, illness, financial hardship. They were not insulated from the news. What distinguished them was something the law of vibration framework describes with precision. They had, mostly without naming it, maintained a dominant internal frequency that their external circumstances could disturb but not permanently override. That is not a spiritual claim. It is a measurable biological one. It shows up in the blood. Now here is where this connects directly to what you may have been told is impossible. The law of attraction, properly understood, is not a visualization technique. It is a description of a real attentional mechanism. What you orient toward consistently, your nervous system begins to resource. The body follows the mind, sustained pointing the way a plant follows light, not metaphorically, but structurally. The Max Planck Institute for Human Development published research on what they called attentional flexibility in adults over 60. The capacity to move attention deliberately toward what is present and away from rumination. The adults who scored highest on this measure did not have better genetics. They had, however, maintained practices that kept their directed attention alive and trainable. Their immune function, their cardiovascular resilience, their biological age, all of it tracked the attention. Year after year, decade after decade, the body arrived somewhere different because the mind had been pointing somewhere different the entire time. This is where biohacking enters, and where most biohacking conversation gets it exactly backward. The optimization culture will sell you the downstream interventions, the cold exposure, the supplements, the sleep tracking, the continuous glucose monitoring, and these are not without value, but they are the equivalent of adjusting the sails while ignoring the direction of the ship. The upstream variable, the one that the Rush University Medical Center identified when they tracked over 1,000 adults across 12 years, is something they called purpose in life. Not happiness, not even optimism. Purpose, the biological state produced when an organism believes it is moving towards something that matters. The people in the top third for purpose showed a 52% lower risk of all-cause mortality than those in the bottom third. That is not the effect size of a supplement. That is the effect size of a frequency you are either living in or you are not. 52%. Let that land in your body for a moment. And here is what none of the biohacking newsletters will tell you, because it complicates the product. You cannot cold plunge your way into a sense of meaning. You cannot track your way into a frequency. The intervention that produces the biological outcome is not downstream. It is upstream of behavior, upstream of habit, upstream even of conscious discipline. It is the vibrational state you are sustaining beneath the level of your decisions, the one shaped by what you believe about whether your presence in the world is doing something that matters. There was a woman in the Pittsburgh study, called Participant 44 in the research to protect her privacy, who had retired from public school administration at 61, was widowed, and lived alone. She ran a monthly book discussion at her kitchen table. 8 people, sometimes 3 if the weather was bad. She disagreed with people she liked. She changed her mind out loud. She was curious in ways that required effort. At 77, her biological age and several key markers registered as 64. She was not doing this as a protocol. She was doing it because she had never let herself fully stop mattering to something. The law of vibration is not asking you to pretend the news isn't heavy. It is not asking you to perform wellness while the culture fragments around you. What it is pointing to, and what these studies keep confirming from the outside in, is that there is a frequency available to you beneath the noise, and that frequency is not passive. It is something you return to deliberately, the way you return attention to the breath, the way Participant 44 returned to her kitchen table every month even when only 3 people showed up. The 250th anniversary of this country is coming. The questions it is raising are not going away. You are going to keep absorbing them because you are a conscious adult, and that is what conscious adults do. The question is whether you absorb them from inside a frequency that can hold weight without being restructured by it, or whether you let the dominant vibration of the news cycle become your own. One of those paths shows up differently in the blood work. You already know which one you want to be on. The knowing is why you're here. You already know the feeling this chapter is about. Not the dramatic crash. Not the morning the test results came back, or the afternoon the phone rang with bad news. The other one. The one with no name and no event attached to it. The low-grade hum underneath ordinary Tuesdays. The sense that your body is braced for something even when the room is quiet and nothing is wrong. You know the feeling of sitting still and not being at rest, of sleeping and not recovering, of going through a day that looked fine from the outside, while something underneath ran on a different register entirely. That feeling has a biological structure, an understanding that structure changes almost everything about how you read the second half of your life. There is a word that endocrinologists use, allostasis, that describes something most people have never been told their body is doing. It does not mean stress. It does not mean balance. It means the continuous anticipatory work your body performs to maintain function under load. Adjusting hormone levels, blood pressure, inflammatory signaling, immune readiness, not in response to what is happening right now, but in preparation for what it expects to happen next. Your body is a predictive system. It does not wait for the event. It calibrates based on history, based on pattern, based on the signature of states you have been inhabiting, day after day, for years. The body reads your chronic interior, weather, and builds around it. Picture a man in a kitchen at noon on an ordinary Tuesday. No emergency, no bad news pending. He is standing at the counter with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand. The refrigerator hummed the only sound, pale winter light across the tile. From the outside, stillness. But inside, the predictive system is already running, calibrating based on what it has learned Tuesday afternoons tend to mean, based on whether this kitchen has historically felt like safety or like waiting for something to go wrong. The inflammatory tone shifts, elevated or suppressed. Immune surveillance tightens or eases. Cellular repair processes get allocated or quietly deferred. All of it happening before he has finished the thought he is half thinking, before the coffee even goes cold enough to notice. That is not metaphor. That is the mechanism. The researchers who measure this look at biomarkers across multiple systems simultaneously: cardiovascular, neuroendocrine, immune, metabolic. What they find is not one thing elevated. It is a pattern. All the systems shifted slightly from their optimal range, as if the entire biological architecture quietly reorganized itself around a chronic interior state. They call the accumulation of these shifts allostatic load. And what the data shows, accumulated across decades of controlled research, is that the chronic background tone, not the acute reactions, not the identifiable traumas with dates attached to them, but the frequency you return to when nothing particular is happening, is not simply a downstream consequence of your circumstances. It is upstream. It is part of the organizing signal. It shapes what the body produces before the circumstances even arrive. Anna Marsland at the University of Pittsburgh has spent years tracking how sustained negative effect, the chronic background variety, not acute stress, alters inflammatory response in ways that accumulate silently over decades. Sheldon Cohen at Carnegie Mellon has run controlled studies on psychological state and susceptibility to infection spanning more than 30 years. The conclusion they keep arriving at from different directions, through different methods, is the same uncomfortable one. The background state is not incidental to biological aging. It is one of the primary authors of it. You have felt this, not as a concept, as something that happened in your body. Think of a season when the interior climate shifted, not because of a single event, but gradually, as some sustained weight either settled in or slowly lifted. You slept differently. Food had a different quality. The same commute felt either tolerable or crushing, not because the road changed, but because something in the register underneath changed. The light through the same windows looked different. Your own hands felt different to you. You were not imagining it. Your inflammatory markers, your immune function, your cardiovascular recovery, all of it was tracking that shift in real time, updating its predictions, reorganizing the architecture. The body knew before you found the words for it. The mind and the immune system are not separate departments that occasionally send memos to each other. They are one integrated system, continuously co-regulating, running on signals that move below the level of conscious narrative. What you habitually feel, not what you think about feeling, but what the body has learned to expect the world to deliver, that is bioactive. It is happening at the molecular level right now. As the week continues, As the news cycles forward, as you sit in whatever room you are sitting in, the people who discovered this are not spiritualists. They are epidemiologists and endocrinologists who noticed that the standard risk factors, diet, exercise, smoking, blood pressure, did not fully account for the variation in biological aging they kept seeing. Something else was organizing the system, something more ambient, something that looked, when you measured it carefully across enough subjects over enough years, like the chronic interior state of the person, the background frequency, the thing underneath the Tuesday afternoon. Now here is what this chapter is not going to do. It is not going to tell you to think positively. It is not going to suggest that a better mood will make your biology cooperate. That would be the same error in reverse, collapsing a complex system into a prescription, swapping one form of wishful thinking for another. What it is going to do is leave you with the weight of this. If the chronic internal state is upstream of biological outcomes, not just reflecting your life, but partly generating the conditions of it, then the question of what state you habitually inhabit is not a soft question. It is not a secondary concern to be addressed after the real problems are handled. It is not a lifestyle addendum for when things calm down. It is the leverage point, the one that was always there, underneath everything else. And that is where the difficulty begins. Because if the chronic state is partly causing your biology, and if it operates largely below the threshold of conscious awareness, you are dealing with something that cannot simply be decided away. You cannot choose your way out of a pattern you cannot see. You cannot shift a frequency you do not know you are broadcasting. The man in the kitchen cannot will his inflammatory tone into a better configuration by resolving to feel differently about Tuesdays. So the question this chapter leaves in your chest, not your mind, your chest, the place where you already know the answer is not simple, is this. How do you change a state you don't even know you're in? Not a rhetorical question. The most practically consequential question this channel has raised. There are specific mechanisms identified by researchers working at the intersection of immunology, neuroscience, and somatic practice, capable of interrupting the allostatic pattern below the level of conscious narrative, not by changing what you think, by changing what the body is doing before thinking begins. That is the next chapter. You already know something is wrong. Not wrong in the way a diagnosis is wrong, or a test result, or a number your doctor circles and says we should watch. Wrong in the way a frequency is wrong. Something underneath the daily rhythm of your life that has shifted, slightly but unmistakably, and that you feel most clearly in the first few seconds after you wake up, before the day's instructions arrive, and you remember what you're supposed to be doing. That feeling has a name, but not the kind that fits neatly into a medical code. It's closer to what happens when you've been reading the news long enough that you stop being surprised by it and start being shaped by it instead. When the weight of what's happening out there begins to reorganize something in here. So let's name it directly. Because the rules of this conversation require honesty before they allow anything else. In the last 18 months, rates of what researchers call anticipatory dread, a chronic low-level activation of threat response systems, have climbed steeply in adults over 45. Not acute fear, not panic, something slower and harder to locate. A background hum of unease that doesn't resolve when the news cycle moves, because the next cycle is already loading. This week, as this chapter was being prepared, federal health agencies released revised projections for chronic disease prevalence in the over 50 population through the next decade. The numbers are not subtle. Cardiovascular events, metabolic dysfunction, early cognitive decline. The curves are moving in the wrong direction, and they're moving faster in populations already carrying elevated stress loads, which is most of us, which is probably you. There was no press conference, no prime-time segment. The data moved quietly through journals and policy briefings, while most people were busy managing the other 17 things that also required managing this week. That's the actual news, not delivered as alarm, delivered as context, because you deserve to know what the information actually says before anyone tells you what to do about it. And here is what this chapter will not do. It will not skip past that weight. It will not pretend the dread is irrational or hand you a supplement protocol and call it empowerment. The dread is information. It's pointing at something real. The question is what you do with it, and more specifically, what tools you have already inside you right now that the dread doesn't want you to remember. There are two frameworks that keep appearing in the research on how people in genuine difficulty maintain physiological resilience, not wellness. Resilience, the capacity to continue functioning, and in some documented cases, to improve measurable biological markers, while the external conditions remain genuinely hard. The first is sometimes called the law of vibration in the older literature on human energy systems, and it maps cleanly onto what modern psychophysiology now measures as coherence. The degree to which your nervous system's outputs, heart rate variability, respiratory rhythm, cortical activity, are organized and synchronized versus fragmented and competing. Coherence is not calm. Calm is a mood. Coherence is a biological state, and it is measurable with standard clinical equipment. What the coherence research shows stubbornly across labs, across populations, is that the body is not simply responding to what is happening. It is responding to the frequency of the internal state that is interpreting what is happening. Two people can read the same news, receive the same information, live inside the same headline, and generate measurably different downstream inflammatory cascades, depending on the state from which they are receiving that information. This is not optimism as a personality trait. It is not wishful thinking. It is a signaling environment, and the body, as always, responds to the environment it perceives itself to be in. The second framework, older still and poorly branded, which is partly why it survives, is what certain traditions call the law of attraction, and what the current literature on predictive processing calls something considerably less elegant. The simplified version, stripped of its commercial wrapping, is this: the nervous system is a prediction engine. It does not experience the world and then react. It generates a model of what it expects to experience, and then filters incoming information through that model. The expectations are not passive. They recruit evidence. They shape perception. And through the same inflammatory pathways that respond to stress and light and food, they shape biology, which means that the internal narrative running underneath your daily life, the one that says this is what decline feels like, the one that reaches for evidence of diminishment the way a tongue finds a sore tooth, is not a description of reality. It is an input, a biological input, processed by the same systems that handle cortisol and melatonin and immune regulation. Ellen Langer has held a chair in psychology at Harvard for over 4 decades. In 1979, she ran a study that the biomedical establishment has spent 45 years not quite knowing what to do with. She took men in their 70s and placed them for 1 week inside an environment designed in precise detail to replicate 1959. The music was from 1959. The magazines were from 1959. The conversations were calibrated to that decade. The men were not asked to remember being younger. They were asked to inhabit a context in which the narrative of who they were had shifted. After 1 week, independent assessors who didn't know the study design evaluated the men on grip strength, posture, gait, vision, and hearing. The experimental group improved on nearly every measure. Some improved significantly. Their bodies had responded to the changed story, not metaphorically, physiologically. Langer's subsequent work on hotel housekeepers who improved their blood pressure and body composition after being told their daily work constituted meaningful exercise, on patients whose outcomes shifted based on the framing of their diagnoses, continued to map the same territory. The body does not simply experience reality. It experiences the interpreted reality, the narrated reality, and it responds accordingly through mechanisms now traceable at the level of cytokine signaling and cellular aging markers. What you tell yourself about your body affects your body, not as a slogan, as a finding with a mechanism. So here is what you actually have, right now, before any new protocol begins, before any appointment is scheduled or equipment purchased or subscription activated. You have a nervous system that is, in this moment, reading this, which means it is receiving information in a particular register, at a particular frequency. You have a prediction engine that is constantly, automatically modeling what comes next. And you have the capacity, not unlimited, not magical, but real and measurable, to shift the coherence of that system. And through it, the downstream signaling environment that either accelerates or slows the biological processes, the news cycle was correctly identifying as urgent. The dread you woke up with this morning is not wrong. It is pointing at real things, but it is also a state, not a sentence. And states can shift, not through denial, not through performed positivity, but through the deliberate use of these two ancient and now scientifically mapped tools. Coherence practice as a daily biological reset, and the conscious, specific, repeated revision of the internal narrative from which you are interpreting everything that is happening to you and around you. This is not the full protocol. There is still the question of what the first move looks like in practice. The specific, concrete, repeatable thing you can do today that begins to shift the frequency from which you are receiving all the rest of this. That answer exists. It is more immediate than you are probably expecting. And knowing it will not make you feel smaller. It will make you feel like someone who has just remembered something important they already knew. You already know this feeling. You're not sure exactly when it settled in, but somewhere between your last genuinely uncertain decision and this particular night, sitting where you're sitting, phone in hand or laptop open, the news still humming in the background, you started treating your own days like something to be managed rather than entered, kept at temperature, got through. That's not a character flaw. It's a posture. And it turns out your body is reading it like a vital sign. Here's the actual news, and it deserves to land as news. On June 14th, 2025, the United States marked its 250th anniversary. Philadelphia hosted the formal commemoration. The Liberty Bell was struck. Fighter jets crossed the Delaware. Officials read the declaration aloud in the same hall where it was signed by men who understood that signing it was an act of biological recklessness, who felt their own pulses, who had families who could be hanged, and signed anyway. The images went out across every platform. Crowds gathered in heat that sat around 90 degrees. Children put their hands on the glass case and looked at the document. And the document looked old in the specific way that things look old when they have outlasted every fear that was ever attached to them. And somewhere inside all of that ceremony, between the military flyover and the evening fireworks, a question surfaced that nobody said out loud but everyone felt. Is this still becoming something? Or has the project quietly shifted into administration mode, maintaining the institutions, speaking the founding language at scheduled intervals, filing the restlessness away? That question is yours, not metaphorically, biologically. Because here's what researchers at University College London found when they tracked vagal tone, the activity of the vagus nerve, which your body uses to regulate heart rate, gut function, and immune response. In adults over 50, they were looking for the usual suspects: poor diet, physical inactivity, disrupted sleep. Those mattered. But the single most consistent predictor of reduced vagal tone was something they described as *reduced orientation toward future reward*, a narrowing of the internal horizon. The body detecting the signal of *, I am maintaining * and responding by down-regulating the very systems built for *. I am moving towards something *. Feel what that means for a second. The vagus nerve doesn't distinguish between literal movement and psychological direction. It reads the overall posture. And when the posture is management mode, when you are existing inside your years rather than inhabiting them, it responds accordingly. Lower tone, higher baseline inflammation, reduced immune surveillance, reduced neuroplasticity. The body is not waiting for your conscious agreement. It is already answering the question you haven't finished asking. This is where a 14-year study published in Psychological Science becomes personal in a way that has nothing to do with wellness culture. Researchers tracked nearly 4,000 adults and measured something deceptively plain: the degree to which people reported feeling engaged versus going through motions. Not happy versus unhappy. Present versus occupying space. The physiological differences between those two groups were not subtle. The engaged group showed measurably lower levels of interleukin-6 and C-reactive protein, inflammatory markers, now understood as central drivers of accelerated biological aging. Not aging in the calendar sense, aging in the cellular sense. The kind that shows up as arterial stiffness, impaired immune function, the body's slowing ability to clear damaged proteins before they accumulate into something harder to reverse. The going through motions group showed the opposite pattern: higher baseline inflammation, faster cognitive processing decline, sleep that fragmented not in duration, but in the quality that actually restores. The body was physically registering the psychological posture of waiting, of being stored at a certain temperature rather than used. And here is the part that should stop you, if you've already started composing the counterargument. The Nurses' Health Study, tracking over 70,000 women for more than 3 decades, found that behavioral and psychological changes made in the 50s produced measurable longevity outcomes, indistinguishable in magnitude from changes made in the 30s. The body is not a document that stops accepting edits. The window of meaningful influence over your own health trajectory does not close at 40 or 50. It remains open deep into the 7th decade of life. The founding men who signed that document in Philadelphia heat, hands probably unsteady, had no guarantee of a next year. You have a reasonable expectation of several decades more. And the research is specific about what happens to those decades depending on one thing: whether the internal posture facing them is engaged or ambient, whether you are still oriented towards something, not toward a goal necessarily, not toward a plan, but toward the next version of your own experience, or whether you have, quietly and without ceremony, settled into administration of what already exists. Notice whether a voice in you is already pushing back. It's too late. The damage is done. This is just who I am now. That voice knows your cadence because it has been living in your head long enough to learn it. That's not wisdom speaking. That's not even experience. It's the posture defending itself. The country turned 250 this summer and was forced, in public, to ask whether it is still becoming something, or whether it has become something that now only maintains itself. Whether the animating restlessness is still alive in the machinery, or whether it shows up now only at ceremonies and gets filed away after. You don't have to let your inner life become ceremonial. What the science says, not as encouragement, but as mechanism, as blood chemistry, as the thing the vagus nerve is actually measuring tonight while you sit wherever you're sitting. Is that the inflammatory profile of asterisk waiting inside a life asterisk? and the inflammatory profile of asterisk actively inhabiting one asterisk are reproducibly, measurably distinct. Your body already knows which one you've been living, and more importantly, it is still capable of reading a different signal. Tonight, at whatever age you are, starting from wherever this finds you, that's not a small thing to know. That's the whole thing. There is a place in the body where news lands before you name it. Not the mind, not the chest exactly. Somewhere between the two. A territory that receives the world before the brain has finished classifying it. You have been living in that territory throughout this video. And if you have been watching long enough, something has already begun to shift there. Not because you decided to shift it, because the attention moved and the body followed. But let's come back to the world first, because the world has been doing something this week, and it deserves to be named directly. The trade numbers came out. The housing figures came out. Another round of layoffs, tech, again, and this time logistics, and the language used to describe them was the same language that has been used for 3 years running. Right sizing, structural adjustment, a response to macroeconomic headwinds. 43-year-olds reading those words at 7 in the morning with a cup of coffee going cold. 51-year-olds forwarding the article to a spouse without comment. The sound of that silence, the specific kind of silence that happens when people who are old enough to have been through one of these before recognize that they are inside another one. That silence has a temperature. It sits low in the chest. It is not panic. It is something more practiced, and therefore more exhausting than panic. It is the body loading the familiar weight before the mind has even decided what to do with it. That is the actual territory we are working in, not abstraction. That, because here is what gets lost when the headlines accumulate. When it is another report, another revision, another quiet confirmation that the thing you were hoping wouldn't happen is, in fact, happening. What gets lost is not optimism. Optimism is too thin for what we need. What gets lost is the direct, physical experience of what is still intact. The body running its 10,000 functions in the background, while the mind rehearses the worst version of the next 18 months. Right now, if you notice your hands, not move them, just notice them, there is probably some warmth there, some weight. The hands are alive in a way that has nothing to do with effort. The lungs are doing the same thing. The heart has beaten somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 times since this video began, without a single instruction from you. The body has been working this entire time, competently, continuously, without panic. That is not a metaphor. That is the actual news. And the body does not distinguish between the threat you are reading about and the threat that is standing in the room with you. It responds to the attention, not to the event. The memory that tightens the stomach before the conscious mind catches up. The voice on the phone that loads the shoulders before you understand what is being said. The kitchen that feels wrong at 6 in the morning before you can name why. The body is reading the emotional texture of incoming information and calibrating to it. It has always done this. The only question is whether you are inside that process or slightly behind it, watching it happen. Here is what changes when you are inside it. You get the signal of the signal, a second read, not a way to stop the calibration, but a way to know it is happening. Right now, your breathing has probably slowed since the last time you noticed it. Not because you controlled it, because the attention settling onto the breath is itself a kind of landing. Blood pressure, the tension held in the jaw, the way the gut is either open or contracted. These respond faster to attention than they respond to willpower. Willpower works against something. Attention works with something that is already running. This is where the last 30 years of neuroscience and the last 30 years of peak performance research arrived at the same address from different directions. Antonio Damasio spent his career watching people with damage to the regions of the brain that process the body's internal signals. Not unintelligent people, not people who had lost their capacity for reason, but people who had lost the body's ongoing read on itself. And what he documented was not a curiosity. It was a catastrophe of perception. Without the body's continuous internal report, these people could not make ordinary decisions, not because they lacked information, because they lacked a stable ground from which to receive it. They had thinking without landing, analysis without anchor. The body's current state was not, it turned out, background noise to consciousness. It was the floor consciousness stood on, which means the floor matters, not as a wellness concept, as a perception question. The state you are in when the information arrives determines what you can actually see in it. What feels possible, what reads as confirmation of disaster, what gets processed as signal, and what gets lost entirely to static. When the body is already running in threat mode, jaw tight, breath shallow, gut contracted, the cold coffee getting colder, every headline confirms the threat, not because the headlines are wrong, because the body arrived at them, already calibrated to find danger. The loop is not a thinking problem. It is a state problem. And no amount of fact-checking reroutes a state. What reroutes a state is a different arrival, not a naive one, not a managed, defended one where you have talked yourself into feeling fine about things that are not fine. Something more specific. A body steady enough to receive hard information without being reorganized by it. Calm in the original sense, not the absence of response, but the presence of a baseline that holds. That baseline is available right now, not because this video has been easy, because you have been staying with something difficult without leaving. You have been holding the weight of real things, the layoffs, the numbers, the particular exhaustion of people who have done this before and are doing it again. And you have stayed. That movement, staying and returning without fleeing, is something the body registers. It files it, and it changes the floor, which brings everything back to the question underneath this whole video. If the body can do this, can shift its receiving state through attention alone, in real time, without forcing anything, then can it do it on an ordinary Tuesday? Not here, with narration holding the space, but when the news breaks on the phone, when the silence happens again at the kitchen table, when the weight arrives in the specific way that weight arrives for people who are no longer young enough to believe it won't. Something in how you are listening right now is different from how you began. Not because the content became easier. It didn't. Because something moved, almost without announcement, into a different register, quieter, more grounded, less compressed. That shift happened inside real material, inside the actual week. The question of whether it can happen without this, without the structure, without the narration, stays open past the end of this video. And it stays open into the next one. There is a number that keeps appearing this week, on every channel, in every broadcast, on the banner behind every politician who steps in front of a camera. 250. The country is turning 250 years old, and the celebrations are already being planned. The fireworks, the speeches, the parades down streets that will be thick with summer heat, and the smell of grilled meat, and something that used to feel simpler than it does now. You've probably seen the coverage, the retrospectives, the comparisons between then and now, the debates about whether this anniversary is something to feel proud of, or complicated about, or both. Those conversations are real, and they deserve to be had honestly. 250 years is not a small thing. The country that emerged from that particular experiment, fractured, improbable, loudly contradictory, has bent the arc of the world in ways that no single headline can contain. But here is what doesn't make the broadcast. Here is what no panel discussion lands on, even when the cameras are rolling and the experts are assembled, and everyone is trying to say something true. The question isn't really about the country's age. It's about yours. Think about the last time you were in a room where someone spoke without urgency, not slowly, not softly necessarily, but without the low-grade alarm that has become so ambient you mostly stop noticing it. A doctor who sat down before talking. A friend who didn't reach for their phone. A conversation where the weight of things was acknowledged and nobody flinched, and nobody performed composure either. Something happened in your body in that room. You didn't decide to let it happen. You didn't manage it or will it toward you. The register of what was entering you changed, and the body responded the way bodies do, not dramatically, not with a name for it, just a small release somewhere in the chest or the shoulders, a slightly different quality of breath, not resolution, a different angle on the same weight. That is what the law of vibration is actually pointing at, when it is stripped of the seminar language and the breathless delivery. Not a metaphor, not an aspiration, a physical description of something that happens to you regularly, that you mostly don't track, because the culture has no particular interest in training you to notice it. The body is always adjusting to the quality of what it is receiving. Language is input. Attention is input. The particular emotional register of a story, a room, a conversation, input. The body is not passive to any of it. It is in constant, ongoing, largely unconscious negotiation with the frequency of its environment. You have felt this. In the bad version, the way a room changes when someone enters who is barely containing something. The way a news cycle at a certain pitch makes your jaw tighten, even when you think you've gone numb to it. And in the good version too, even if those moments are quieter and leave less of a mark. The particular quality of a morning that arrived without demand. a piece of music that did something to the inside of the afternoon. The physical experience of being genuinely heard by someone who wasn't in a hurry. That is the whole territory. Not mysticism, not self-help. A description of what is already happening, whether or not you have words for it. So back to the number, 250. When a nation celebrates a birthday, what it is really doing underneath all the spectacle is pausing to take inventory. We are still here. We have made it through things that seemed unsurvivable. We are not what we were, and we are not yet what we might become. The anniversary isn't a verdict. It's a marker, a stake in the ground that says, we are tracking this. We are paying attention to the distance traveled. Now turn that lens around. Not harshly, not as a confrontation. Just turn it. How many years have you been here? And more specifically, in what state have you been arriving at those years? Not are you healthy enough? Not have you done enough, or achieved enough, or accumulated enough of whatever the culture decided was worth accumulating. Those are the wrong measurements. Chronological measurements miss almost everything important. The question is, what has been the quality of how you are living inside your own life? Not what you have, how you are arriving at what you have. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that belongs to people who have been paying attention. You are not naive. You have watched things fall apart that were supposed to hold. You have recalibrated more than once. You have gotten good, maybe too good, at absorbing bad news without flinching, at continuing to function while the world does its difficult, unpredictable thing. That competence is real. Do not dismiss it. But competence at absorbing damage is not the same as living in a register that feeds you. The country at 250 years has scars. It has fissures that run deep, visible in the tone of every debate, in the exhaustion behind the celebration. The people planning the fireworks know this. The people who will watch the fireworks know this. You hold the birthday cake and the reckoning in the same two hands, and you do not pretend one cancels out the other. That is not cynicism. That is maturity. And maturity, real maturity, the kind the body knows and not just the mind, is the ability to hold the weight of what is true and still locate the signal that keeps you alive. Not optimism, not denial. The specific quality of a person who has seen enough that they are no longer surprised by difficulty, and who has also, somewhere along the way, decided not to let difficulty set the entire frequency of their life. You have probably known someone like this. An older relative, maybe, or a mentor. Someone who had earned the right to be bitter and wasn't. Not because they were performing grace, but because they had found something steadier than either bitterness or false cheer to stand on. That is the territory. That is what this is pointing at. 250 years is not a victory lap. It is a proof of survival. And survival, when you look at it honestly, is made of something more than endurance. It is made of the quality of signal a system generates under pressure. Countries are systems. Bodies are systems. The physics is not entirely different. A country survives when enough of its people are generating something. Call it coherence. Call it civic will. Call it whatever your particular vocabulary permits. That pulls the center back when the edges start to fray. And a body survives, not just biologically, but in any meaningful sense, when the signal it is generating is not entirely composed of alarm and accommodation. The research on this is durable, if not loudly famous. What longitudinal work on aging consistently finds is that one of the strongest predictors of what researchers call biological resilience is not the absence of stress. It is what happens in the body between stressors, the recovery state, the baseline between events, not how tough you are under fire, how you are when the fire is temporarily out. That baseline is not fixed. It is responsive. It is, in fact, the thing most worth paying attention to, and the thing the culture is least interested in helping you cultivate, because there is no clean product to sell against it. So here is the reframe this chapter is actually after. America turns 250, and the celebration is complicated, and the complications are real, and none of that is being dismissed. But the thing worth actually sitting with, the thing that no network will put on a banner, because it cannot be photographed or monetized or broadcast in a parade, is the quality of how a person or a country or a system arrives at its next moment. Not how many years, in what state, not the accumulation, the orientation. If you are reading this, you have survived a great deal. That is not a small thing. That is the only thing that makes any of the rest of it possible. And the question worth carrying into the week the fireworks go off is quieter than any of the speeches will be. It is not how many more years. It is not what the country should have done differently, or what you should have done differently. It is something closer to, what would it actually look like in a specific and ordinary life, to stop measuring by duration and start measuring by quality of signal, not as a philosophy. On a Tuesday, when nothing is on fire and no one is watching and the anniversary banners have come down, and it is just you and the particular frequency you are choosing, or not choosing, to inhabit, that question has a different weight than it appears to. Sit with it long enough, and it stops being rhetorical. There is something that happens at the end of a long video. Not at the beginning, not in the middle, but right here, in the place where the arguments have landed, and the body has had time to catch up to what the mind was still sorting through. You've been here for a while now, and something shifted. Maybe you noticed it. Maybe you didn't, not consciously. But at some point in this conversation, not when I told you to, not because of a technique, something in how you were receiving the information changed. The chest was a little less braced. The breath came down an inch or two. The news stayed the news, but you were no longer quite inside it the same way. That is a physical fact, not a metaphor. Something in the room changed temperature. That is worth naming, because we said something earlier in this video that deserves to land now fully, without rushing past it. What deserves celebrating on any anniversary, national or personal, is the frequency at which you are arriving at your own life. Not the achievements, not the resume, not even the health markers, as important as those are. The frequency, the state you carry into the room before anything has happened yet. That is the thing that shapes everything downstream. And tonight, or this morning, or whatever hour you found this, you arrived here and you stayed. You know what that costs in an attention economy. You know what else you could have been doing. Now, I'm not going to tell you to subscribe because we make great content. That's not the reason. I'm going to tell you something more specific. This channel exists because the news is not going away. The geopolitical weight is not going away. America at 250 years old is a country still carrying unresolved tension in its bones. The way a man carries an old injury, functional, mobile, but aware of it in certain weather, aware of it when the barometric pressure drops, and something in the hip reminds him of a morning 20 years back. That story continues, and it continues with or without us. The question was never whether the world would keep generating pressure. It will. That is the nature of living in time. The question, the only question that actually matters for someone who has watched enough cycles of history to know how this tends to go, is what state you are in when it arrives. That is what this channel is built around. The news reported honestly with the full weight it deserves. And then the question underneath the news. How are you receiving this? And is there a different way to stand inside it? Not a spiritual bypass of the real. Not headlines sanded down until they feel manageable. Not positivity performed over the top of genuine darkness. The actual thing, held at a frequency that doesn't hollow you out. Because there is a difference between being informed and being corroded. And most people past 40 have felt both and can tell you exactly which one they've been living in. The work we do here is not a supplement. It is not a protocol. It is the practice of receiving the world in a way that does not eat the years you have left. If that made sense to you today, not as a concept, but as something you felt while you were sitting here, something in the jaw unclenching, something in the shoulders dropping half an inch, then subscribing is not a favor to this channel. It is a choice you make for yourself. It is saying, I want to keep having access to this. I want the news to arrive to me this way. I want to keep practicing this. That is what the button means when you press it. Not loyalty to a creator, not algorithmic support. A personal decision that this is where you receive the world from now on. There are no notifications you will dread. There are no videos that will leave you smaller than when you arrived. That is the one promise this channel makes, and it is the only one worth making. What you experienced here today is repeatable. It is not luck. It is not mood. It is a practice, and the more consistently you return to it, the more the body begins to recognize it as the baseline rather than the exception. Not in one breakthrough moment, in the quiet accumulation of mornings where you chose this instead of the alternative, and noticed 6 months later that you were sleeping differently, arguing less, sitting with hard news without the old familiar spike of cortisol that used to last until noon. So if you are not subscribed, this is the moment. Not because the video is ending, because you are. And the question that opens now, the one this channel will stay with, is concrete enough to feel. What actually changes in a man who keeps making this choice for a year, or for 5 years? Not in theory, in the body. in the quality of his attention, in what he passes on to the people around him. Someone at this age, with this much history behind him, who decides to stop being consumed by the frequency of the news and start shaping the frequency he brings to it instead. What does he look like on the other side of that? What does he notice first? What closes down and what opens? That is what comes next. What the man at the table was afraid of was neither time running out nor time wasted. It was never having felt the difference between the two. He knows that now, not because someone told him, because something shifted in the weight of his own hands while he wasn't looking for it to. He's back at the table, same table as before, the one near the window where the afternoon light comes in at an angle and catches the grain of the wood in a way that makes you notice the wood for the first time, even if you've eaten at that table for 20 years. Same coffee, probably cold now. Same house settling around him with its small sounds. The tick of something expanding in the walls. The faint rhythm of a ceiling fan 2 rooms over. But something is different, and he can't name it completely. That's the part worth paying attention to. It isn't relief. It's not the clean exhale of a problem solved. It's something more like the difference between carrying a bag of rocks and carrying a bag of sand. The weight is similar, but the way it distributes is not. The rocks press into specific places. The sand spreads, shifts, accommodates the body that holds it. He's still holding something. He just isn't sure it's the same thing he started with. He picks up his coffee, takes a sip. It's cold and he doesn't mind. America turns 250 years old this summer. We've reported that honestly. The parades, the declarations, the arguments underneath the celebrations about what this country is still becoming, what it has unfinished, what it has never resolved. That weight is real. It belongs in the conversation. We didn't look away from it, but the whole time we were talking about a nation's longevity, we were actually talking about yours, about the gap between chronological time, the years that accumulate whether you notice them or not, and felt time, which is something different entirely. Felt time is what happens when you're actually inside your own life, when you're present enough to register the texture of a moment, when you're not just surviving the news but receiving it without being dismantled by it. Most people never stop to wonder whether those two things, the years they've lived and the life they've actually felt, are anywhere close to the same number. The man at the table is starting to wonder. That's not a small thing. We covered the science in this video as reported fact, not as a brochure for anything. Here's what the research actually shows. A person sitting in a state of chronic low-grade threat, say, a 53-year-old who checks the news before his coffee has finished brewing, who carries the geopolitical situation in his shoulders all day without naming it. That person is running a different internal chemistry than one who has been given consistent, deliberate space to regulate. The difference is not subjective. It shows up in inflammatory markers. It shows up in cortisol curves measured across weeks. It shows up in the telomere length of immune cells, the biological record of how many times the body has had to fight its way back from the edge of overwhelm. The posture of chronic defense is expensive, not metaphorically. The body runs a tab, And the tab is specific and cumulative, in the way that compound interest is specific and cumulative. It doesn't announce itself in any single transaction, but you feel it in the account balance eventually. What we also reported, without hype and without the language of a weekend wellness retreat, is that the nervous system is not a fixed architecture. It responds to input. It changes based on what it's given. A nervous system that has been, deliberately and repeatedly, offered the conditions to downregulate is measurably different from one that has not. In the way it receives stress the next time stress arrives, in the speed with which it recovers, in whether the alarm stays on after the actual threat has passed. Not fixed, not cured, regulated. There is a significant difference between those words, and the man at the table is beginning to feel it in a way he couldn't have described at the start of this conversation. 250 years is a long time to hold something together. Nations that last that long do so not because they avoided stress. No such nation exists, but because something in their structure could absorb pressure without the whole thing fracturing. The capacity to flex without collapsing, to register damage without mistaking damage for the end. That same architecture, or the failure of it, lives in you. In the biology you've been inside for 45, 50, 55, 60 years. In the accumulation of every headline absorbed at the wrong hour, every 3 a.m. cortisol spike that fired before the mind had any context for what triggered it. Every year of receiving the world's emergencies, as though your adrenal system were the appropriate venue for processing them. You didn't do that because you were weak. You did it because you're paying attention, because you care, because a person who doesn't flinch at the state of the world isn't strong. They are simply absent. The question was never whether to feel it. The question has always been what you do with the feeling before the feeling does something with you. The man at the table will try to name what changed and not quite get there, and that's all right. Some shifts don't arrive with language attached. They arrive first as a change in how something sits, in the chest, in the jaw, in the particular way the shoulders hold themselves when there's nothing immediate to brace against. The explanation follows later, if it comes at all. Often the most durable changes are the ones that precede their own description by weeks. He's not running the math on time, remaining the way he was before. He's not counting forward or accounting backward. He's just sitting with cold coffee and the light at its angle through the glass, and the weight of the afternoon feels not lighter exactly, but differently distributed. The sand instead of the rocks. The same load carried in a way the body can actually work with. He sets the cup down. The house makes one of its small sounds, something in the wall, something settling, and then goes quiet. We started this video with a country turning 250 years old and a question underneath the celebration. Not about what the country would become, but about the quality of the life you're living inside your own. The question was never about them. It was always about the specific, biological, measurable experience of being you. At this age, receiving this world in the body you actually have. We're not leaving you with resolution. Resolution is for things that are finished, and this isn't finished. The news will come again before tonight, probably before you've set your phone down, and it will carry whatever it carries. What's different now is not the news. It's the interval, the space between the headline landing and your nervous system, deciding what to do with it. That space existed before. It may be slightly more available to you now, not because we told you what to think, because something in the material reminded the system of a capacity it already had and had been spending no time in. That's where we'll leave it. Not closed, but grounded. The table, the light, the man who started carrying something differently and isn't yet sure what to call it. That's enough to work with.